I wouldn't quote me on this, but I think that today's interview is my very first interview with an actual mogul, which may or may not be one or two steps behind a magnate. I mean, I suppose I could look it up, but why bother? Either way, as a kid who graduated high school in 1984, the bands that were represented by Miles Copeland, particularly those who were on his roster for his record label IRS Records, reflected a major part of my youth. From my early teenage years all the way through my years in college and beyond, Miles Copeland has had a hand in managing some of the most important music of my life. This was a roster that included REM, the Go-Go's, the English Beat, the Cramps, the Fall, Gary Newman, Fine Young Cannibals, the Buzzcocks, Squeeze, Wall of Voodoo, and then, of course, there was The Police, featuring his brother Stuart Copeland, along with Sting and Andy Summers, who in 1984 were the biggest frickin' band in the world. His story is a fascinating one, from his childhood abroad being raised by one of the founding members of the CIA, to booking a European tour with the Sex Pistols, to negotiating deals with bands and distribution companies, to managing artists that would become legendary. Miles Copeland has written a brand new memoir entitled Two Steps Forward, One Step Back, and it's freaking awesome. This is my conversation with Miles Copeland on Baxy's Musical Podcast.
It's Baxy's Musical Podcast.
I literally just finished the book about 2 hours ago, so everything is...
You got the book.
I did get the book, and everything is still fresh in my mind. I have to say, I graduated high school in 1984, and so everything in this book is right in that time frame, from high school through college. It's what an incredibly nostalgic walk through a career that quite literally informed just about everything that happened to me between the ages of 15 on.
Did you like the book?
I loved the book. I loved the book.
Well, I appreciate it. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
I loved it. I do want to get to the music business and to music a little bit more, but one of the things I found so fascinating about the story is how you grow up and your family. Your dad was a founding member of the CIA. Your mom was in British intelligence. You got four very active kids in the house, all being raised all over the world, being raised by spies. That had to be an amazing way to grow up.
Yeah, well, I guess it was.
What was it like to have your parents involved in that kind of? I mean, were you sitting around the breakfast table talking about how you're going to defeat communists today? I mean, how did that work?
Well, I think really, I mean, the difference is growing up overseas. You tend to be exposed with things that you would not really. Well, when you become very aware of who you are, i.e., you're very aware of you're being an American, because Americans are looked upon differently. At least they were then. So you are already sort of in a special place being an American. My father, his job was knowing what was going on, basically, which is really what which intelligence is really all about. So when the word spy is always, it carries a sort of baggage with it, like it's James Bond or something. But basically, the essence of intelligence is knowing what's going on. So you meet government people, you meet, everything that goes on in a society is really what's going on in that society, and that kind of tells you what you can expect politically or whatever,
But you got a world view that many people, certainly in America, could never possibly understand, and I imagine that as you're establishing yourself, as an adult and through your teenage years, that to have that experience had to be, I don't want to say that was any better or worse than anybody else's, but certainly unique amongst people you knew. I mean, if you're living, in the Middle East, other kids your age were not having the same type of experience you were having. They were just going on and living their lives.
Well, you become exposed to other things, like you see. You look at the news now, and you look at some of the people being interviewed, and it's like, yeah, USA, fuck yeah, all this sort of stuff, and it's like, well, the greatest little country in the, everybody talking about how great everything is, well, you live up in other countries and say, well, some of these other countries aren't so bad, or they're terrible in some other way, So you actually see firsthand, how poverty can be so crippling in some countries, and you can see how some societies deal with things like, if you're living in England or in Holland or in France or in whatever, there are a lot of things about those countries which are great, much better than America, So you don't fall afoul of this sort of vision of America being the be-all and end-all, but you're also very proud of being an American, because when you're in places like Egypt or Lebanon or Syria, everybody wants to be an American.
Yeah. It's interesting that of the four kids in the family, three of you went into music, and no one went into either public service or into intelligence or any of that stuff. And in fact, in the book, I believe your dad at one point says you wouldn't like working for the CIA anyways.
It all changed. Remember when the CIA was first formed, it was about knowing what's going on and hiring experts. I think I did say it in the book. You would, if you were setting up the CIA. Well, I'm not sure if I can't even remember what I wrote. But if you're setting up, you want to know what's going on in Russia. Well, you want to hire some guys that escaped from Russia who can really read a newspaper and know what the nuance is.
Right.
So you're going to hire some emigre who's at Columbia University. Well, when Vietnam happened, and you now had more military people kind of coming into the CIA because they were starting to do operations, the military people just almost habitually are suspicious of anybody who's intellectual. Anybody that can see the other side, they're suspicious of.
Right.
Well, that means you're sympathetic to the other side. How can we trust you to do the right thing, kind of thing. So now it's like, there's the political correctness. You have to believe that something is this way, and that's it, And to question that is considered disloyal somehow, So my father, having grown up in the Middle East, and grown up around the world, you can see things from two sides. So looking at things from only one side is just obviously stupid. So he talked me out of being in the CIA because he said, look, it's become more and more anti-intellectual and much more, shut your mouth and just this is what you're supposed to do.
Right.
So that's why I didn't go into the CIA.
There's a part of the in the book where you talk about having to literally evacuate your home because of the political climate in the Middle East. I mean, when you look back at something like that and you look at the historical significance of that moment, obviously you have a different perspective on what goes on in that part of the world than most Americans would ever get the chance to. I mean, do you still see the Middle East in a different way than the rest of the world sees it?
I think you have to, because you understand what those people think. I mean, part of the exercise really is when you live in Lebanon or in Egypt or in Syria or in India or in Africa or whatever, you understand where they're coming from, which you then and then you understand where you're coming from. So.
Right.
And they don't always coincide in terms of what's good for America. In some cases, may not be good for Lebanon or be good for Syria or something. So you see that there are two sides to every single issue. I think that's probably the major thing. Whereas, in the world we're in today, there are no two sides. It's only one side, which is why America's so divided. And you're not supposed to think that there are two sides to a story.
I think that's absolutely true, and especially when you talk about the divisions, within our country, whether they're politically or socially. It's like we've gotten to the point now where it can only be our way, and I can only be right, as opposed to looking at
my way or the highway.
Absolutely,
and you go to you look at them interviewing some Trump people. Let's say, I take that as an example, and they say, well, suppose it turned out that Trump was this. I don't care.
Right.
What you mean if all the facts showed that what you were thinking is wrong, that didn't register with you, you're still going to keep your view? Yes. You think, well, that's just stupid. But that's based basically where the world has ended up right now. It's like my way or the highway. That's it.
So where does music come in your family? I know your dad was musical, but was music always a part of your childhood? Is that where it germinates for you guys?
Well, the real reality was I think everybody that grows up is interested in music one way or another. I mean, some people you just buy records, or you listen to the radio, or you go to parties and you dance or whatever, but you play the jukebox or whatever. So I think the difference was, for me, is that I always looked upon it like everybody else would be something that other people did, and I would buy their records, or I would, play the jukebox, or I would listen to the radio. But when I saw my brother Stuart up there actually drumming in a little band, it's like, oh, actually, you could actually be a participant. And I think probably his being in a band altered my perception a bit about the possibility that, well, you could actually participate in it. You wouldn't just be somebody viewing it. In the case of Ian, I brought him into the business, and he'd gone off to the Middle East or something, and I brought him into the business. So I think that from the musical standpoint, it probably would have started with Stuart, and then it registered in my head, and then I brought in my brother Ian, and it went from there.
Obviously, the world has changed very much when it comes to bands, even the kinds of music. The story about helping to put together Wishbone Ash is actually a pretty interesting story. It's a band that maybe not a lot of people remember, but it is a band that had significance at the time. I certainly remember playing them on the radio, but like minor hits, back even in the 80s. So when you start doing that, do you start thinking in terms of the next couple of steps? Like maybe if I go and find another band, or you eventually started working with Squeeze and a few others. Are you thinking in terms of multiple bands?
Well, to tell you the truth, it's following the line of least resistance. I had never thought, in 1962, for instance, I was going to go into the music business. It really wasn't until the little group that Stuart had played with in Beirut had come to see me and said, "Will I help them on a show?" And then I kind of helped them out. Then the next thing I know, a promoter comes to me and says, "Well, I want to hire your lights I'm bringing this British group over." That led to me becoming friends with Rupert's people. Then I go to London, and they come to me and say, "Well, we want you to be our manager." And it's like, are you out of your mind? What do I know about music? I know nothing,
But you do.
And then I got drafted, But then I went back to England, and I really had no vision of what I wanted to do. But music business has seemed. And part of the message of the book is, there are a lot of things that you can do in life that don't really require, deep education, let's say,
right.
Or if you want to be a lawyer, you've got to go to law school. If you want to be a doctor, you've got to learn about the body. But rock and roll, who's to say what is good and what isn't good? It's like, well, do I like it or don't I like it? That's enough, really. And there are a lot of areas that is pretty much all you need, basically, is trusting your own instincts.
Well, I want to ask you about that, because that seems to be kind of the storyline through most of your career, is you following your instincts, sharing those instincts with an artist, and either having them, listen, or turn a deaf ear to it. And for the most part, within your book, it's like a lot of the things that you had suggested to bands were really valid and intelligent and well thought out ideas. I mean, I think of the band Squeeze, for example, and it's a band that that I know. And in fact, I interviewed Glenn Tilbrook last year, and it's an interesting band the way you describe it. It really almost like there's two camps in that band at the same time. But you were making suggestions for them that might have broadened their appeal here in the States, where they really didn't get much notice, or at least the notice that they would have gotten, say, in the UK.
Yeah, well, they got notice, but it's like it's like the chart. If you sell 1 billion records, but you do it over 10 years, you probably don't show up in the charts. but you sell 1 billion records in the space of a year, and you're going to be number one. You know, so you could have two bands of equal sales. One everybody knows about, and the other one is like, well, they're just some small fry, but yet they sold the same number of records and have the same number of fans. And that was sort of the Squeeze story, is that they never really catered to the marketing and promotion like let's say the Police did, you know.
Right.
It was hard to get photographs of them. The name wasn't particularly good. They didn't do a lot of the stuff that you would want them to do, you know. They were people that looked on the negative side as opposed to the positive side, you know. And so you would find that it was kind of pulling teeth to get them to do stuff. Yeah, that was not the case with Jules Holland, but it was the case of Chris and Glenn, is that you would suggest something and their first response would be, well, what are my friends going to think? Or, you know, how can this hurt me? And in other words, they thought of all the reasons why it wouldn't work, whereas what you really would like would be to somebody who would look on it and say, well, what the hell? Yeah, sounds good. Let's do it.
Right.
You know,
and
which was really what the Police were all about, and so was Jules Holland, you know.
And it sounds like Jules Holland was nothing but open-minded, and maybe that's the reason why he's had a long career, not necessarily purely in music, but, you know, in television and everything else. There was a part of the book that talks about how he turned down an opportunity to work here in the States for Lorne Michaels. Do you think he made the right choice in doing that?
Well, he did work for Lorne Michaels, and we were going back and forth on Concord, but, you know, I forget how many months it was that he was on the Sunday night show. But finally, Jules just said, look, you know, my life is falling apart here. I'm losing all my friends. I'm spending all my life on an airplane. And, you know, there's more to life than just being in an airplane. And, you know, so he ended up asking me to cancel the Lorne Michaels show. So then that was actually the first time anybody had ever canceled on Lorne Michaels. He was just shocked.
I bet. You probably don't get a chance to do that twice, I would imagine.
No. But of course, Jules has ended up as an icon in England. I mean, he's an MBE. You know, I mean, he has the biggest Christmas show in England, and every Christmas, and he's on TV every. You know, I mean, he's an icon. You know, so and of course, the BBC show airs across Europe, and he even comes to the United States. You know, well, he's not that well known here, but yeah, I mean. Would it have been smarter for him on a money basis to accept the Lorne Michael thing and be huge in America? Well, yeah. But Jules was not all about money.
One of the things that they think, you know, it was maybe problematic for them is about timing. You know, here they are coming out like around in the 70s and into the 80s. There's punk going on in England. They are clearly not a punk band. While punk was grabbing all kinds of headlines, it's maybe hard to push a band that's writing, you know, well-crafted pop songs at a time when people are focused on, you know, the Sex Pistols and the Clash. I mean, the timing for that band, I think, was off. I don't know if it's too early or too late, but the timing just didn't seem right for them.
Well, I think you're right. I mean, that was part of the drama I had, is that I had this young band, and I could see what was happening, and so I decided that I wanted them to be part of the new generation and not part of the old. But they didn't really fit either one. You know, they were more like a Beatles group. You know, I mean, good pop songs. You know, I pushed them every way I could without having to make them into punks. I pushed them into this sort of the new wave, which is really where they ended up. But they were never really comfortable in what is really an important part of anything is the marketing of something. You know, I mean, Glenn, I don't know if you noticed from the interview you did with him, but he doesn't really think of marketing. He thinks of, you know, writing the song, and he lives in a world of music. He doesn't think about marketing. He doesn't think about the photograph. He doesn't think about the outrage, the clothes you wear. I mean, if you look at a Lady Gaga or a Kiss or whatever, you look at, or Elvis Presley even, and you look at, or the Beatles, you know, you look at, well, image was a big part of it, and that was certainly the case of the Sex Pistols. It was certainly the case of the Police, you know, so, and the Go-Go's. I mean, all girls, you know. I mean, so if you don't have some kind of unifying image, it's much harder. And that's why I've always said that they were probably the hardest group that I ever had to manage, because they had all this talent, yet you couldn't really pull it together into a cohesive understandable one-liner. In effect, they didn't quite fit anything. It was like this jigsaw puzzle where you could see it was a beautiful picture, but you couldn't quite get the picture because not every piece just fit.
You mentioned the Sex Pistols, and obviously there's a transition between the new wave and the punk bands, especially in the UK. And I know that you were a part of arranging a tour for the Sex Pistols at a time when allegedly they could not get any gigs. But then there's a part of the book that explains the rationale that a Malcolm McLaren had for that, and it really wasn't about whether they could get gigs. It really was about more of the fabrication of publicity more than anything else with Malcolm.
Yeah, I had actually booked the Sex Pistols. I found it not that difficult. I'd get on the phone and I'd call a club and I'll say, look, would you be interested in the Sex Pistols? And they would say, well, yeah, okay, I'll give it a shot. And actually, I took them to Holland, and I had the distinct impression, talking to Johnny Rotten and to all the band members, they really liked the idea that they would be playing a gig. They looked forward to it. So they saw themselves as a band. But when I went to Malcolm McLaren's office, and I said, okay, look, I booked some shows for your band. Can you do them? And he would be basically, well, no, he would give me some excuse. And, a couple of times I would keep going up there and say, well, I've moved those dates, so can you do it now? And he would look at, I did it through 2 or 3 times. And then finally he started yelling at me. I mean, he was irate. He said, don't you get it? I get more press saying this band can't get gigs. And the fact that you're actually going out there and getting me gigs screws me. Yeah, get the fuck out of my office. It was like, holy shit. He had no interest whatsoever in the Sex Pistols doing shows and becoming a real group. It was all about the manipulation of the media. And of course, it played very well to the media because they liked outrage. I mean, it's much more interesting to read an article about something that's outrageous than it is about something that's all, if you picked up the news and it said, well, everything was sweetness and light today, so you wouldn't bother reading the newspaper, I think it's the secret of Donald Trump. The more outrageous, the better.
It's interesting when you look at that time, and I mean, at some point, the Sex Pistols did come to the U.S., and that tour was a disaster. And it's not like there weren't bands here in the United States that were kind of doing punk too. I mean, certainly the Ramones, preceded the Sex Pistols, but those UK bands were a real hard sell here in the States. Bands that were great, like the Buzzcocks and the Jam, and other great bands that had wonderful songs, just for whatever reason were not as marketable here. Do you have a sense of why that was? I mean, was it too British? What was that?
Well, no, I think remember the rationale of the punks were that they were basically kicking the doors down, and they were basically against the vibe of the punks were, when they referred to the old bands, they referred to old farts, basically. And they were actually they would champion the fact that they really couldn't play their instruments very well, So they were sort of an anti-music movement in a way. And the fact is that most of the bands that had, take the Sex Pistols and the Clash. I mean, the reason the Sex Pistols tour was a fiasco was because they brought Sid Vicious in as the bass player. For Christ's sake, the guy was a maniac. If Malcolm McLaren was a real manager and really was trying to promote an act, then he would have made sure that the band could go out and play, and that they would not just wreck everything, So they were very much of the mind that, look, it's about getting press. It's not about actually being able to do a gig. I mean, I know people that went to the show that they did here in L.A., and they were just disappointed and actually, I think Johnny Rotten, you look at YouTube, he actually says, well, you're all disappointed, aren't you? Because they really weren't very good, because Malcolm didn't let them be good. He didn't want them to be good. I think the Clash probably suffered from the same thing, because their manager really was an idiot. Bernie Rhodes was the manager. The guy was an idiot.
And you think how long it took for the Clash to break in the States. I mean, obviously the band knew more of what they needed for themselves than anybody else did.
Yeah, I thought I had a conversation with Joe Strummer, and I thought, the band was actually quite intelligent. I thought they were a lot more intelligent than Bernie was, And so I actually had a feeling that they knew more of what was going on than he did. But I think they suffered from the fact that the whole setup was wrong. They really weren't. Well, they didn't do what I did with the police. We went out and we played the clubs and got out there and did it. And I think it's in Sting's mind, for instance, he said, "Look, people paid tickets to see our show. Let's give them a hell of a show." And out they went and they did it. Whereas I think the mentality of the Sex Pistols and the Clash was, well, to hell with people. Let's wreck everything. And I think that in the end that hurt everybody. But there were bands like the Buzzcocks who continued to tour the United States, and a lot of their songs have been picked up and been on commercials. So the Buzzcocks, in the end, did very well. Ramones, remember, they were sort of a punk group, but they actually could sort of play, although they were doing 3-chord songs. They could play, and they all had very long hair. So they were punks in a way, but they were very different from the English punks. I mean, the Dead Boys were more in line with what was going on in England, know, and Jello Biafra with the Dead Kennedys, and some of the bands like that. There were some sort of aggressive bands in the U.S. as well,
and all bands that IRS would have dealings with or attempted to. But I do want to talk about the Police because, like I said, in high school there was no band bigger than the Police. I mean, they were just absolutely enormous. I read Andy Summers' book about a year ago. What was interesting to me, first of all, you got 3 guys with very strong personalities, all at different ages. I mean, Andy is a little bit older than the other guys, but they're where they're coming from musically is very different than any band at the time. Sting's coming from jazz, and Andy's coming from a long history of progressive music and all kinds of music, really. And then there's your brother, who's a tremendously influential drummer. They're pigeonholed in a way of being new wave, but what they became was so much more than that. Explain the beginnings of your involvement with the Police.
Well, Stewart wanted to be a punk group. He liked the idea of the stripped down, little equipment, not a lot of roadies, in control of your own life kind of vibe that the punk thing celebrated, So
Right.
He was looking more at the sort of structural organization of a punk group. And he was looking at songs that were more on the aggressive side. It was, Nothing Achieving and Fallout were basically sort of angry songs, which is really what the punk thing was all about. But underneath all of that was Sting, who was writing great pop songs, And Andy could play anything, but he had to be directed by Sting and Stewart and more than anything. If he was left to his own devices, he would have not necessarily played exactly the way he did. But, he was influenced, and he also got caught up in this idea of the being in control of your life and less is more kind of vibe, But when Sting started writing songs like Roxanne and Can't Stand Losing You and those more pop songs, I think Stewart's world of aggressive sort of Fallout and Nothing Achieving don't really represent the Police anymore. So it became more of a morphing towards Sting's version of the songs, but they brought along with it the sort of reggae influence which the punks brought into England, I think largely because it was not old fart music, and it was also the reggae music was, black music from Jamaica and whatever, and it was also sort of underground, sort of like the punks were. And so that flavor, which was quite exciting, it was like an inversion. Instead of, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, it was the reverse, and that meant you could play the same song with that different inversion, and all of a sudden the song took a different kind of vibe to it, So the Police incorporated this sort of aggressive, freewheeling world of punk, but added to it real musicianship, and that and of course the songs of Sting.
The story of Roxanne, I thought was amazing. That here's the biggest song that they do. I mean, it literally is the springboard to the rest of their career. and it almost didn't get put on the record. And it almost didn't even get released at all because I don't know, was it a matter they didn't have confidence in it, or was it just because it's a ballad and doesn't fit, the idea of
Well,
a
because
punk band?
remember, this was at the height of the punk thing, and when Stewart came to me and was all panicked that that they had no tour and there was no future, and he was thinking, and I think the band were thinking, well, we're in the punk world and we got to make an aggressive sounding album, So in that context, Roxanne was a very minimal ballad, and it did not have, it was not angry, it was not aggressive in any way.
But when you
when I went to hear the album, they played all the songs to me, which were sort of fit the punk mold, which was what they thought they were and what they wanted to be sold as, and I think probably largely at the pushing of Stewart, because he had actually formed the Police in the first place. So he was very much into the sort of the punk ethic, So Roxanne didn't really fit. But when they played all the songs, and I finally said, okay, look, I'm here. I drove, it was an hour and 50-minute, hour and a half or something to get to Leatherhead, I'd made the trek there, so I said, well, I'm paying for this damn thing, so play me the damn song, basically, So basically, the engineer puts the song on, after where the police are saying, don't play it. No, he'll hate it. Because they just assumed I would be listening for a punk song. And that when a ballad came on, I would just dismiss it out of hand. So they didn't want to go through the drama of me dismissing the song out of hand. So the engineer just said, well, I'm playing it. And he put it on, and I'm listening to this song. And, of course, now I'm hearing a song that is unique, and it's true to really what the band is. In other words, it had all the elements that really made the Police what they became, I think the band had made the mistake of just assuming that I would be listening for a punk. It's like putting blinkers on a horse, You only look straight ahead. My view was always take the blinkers off, and you never know what can come from the side, And
Right.
I think that's part of the theme of the book is that, you never really know when the next thing is going to happen. It may come from a totally left field standpoint. So be open to that left field. And that effectively is what Roxanne was. It was completely left field.
It goes back to, your own instincts. I mean, you hear this song, maybe they're too close to it to have a real objective eye. You hear this song, you're saying, this is an instant classic, but yet they felt strong enough to have recorded it in the first place. But it's like, when you hear a song like that for the very first time, and you're one of the first people to hear it, what is your first reaction?
What I said to them is, gentlemen, you've recorded a classic. This song is going to change our lives.
And it did. I mean, it changed their lives and yours.
Yeah, it changed all our lives right there. I mean, those were the words I said. I can't remember the exact words, but I think it was pretty close to what I just said. Is that, gentlemen, I remember saying, gentlemen, you've recorded a classic. This song is going to change our lives. And it's bigger than I can handle on my own, and I'm taking it to A&M Records tomorrow, and I'm going to get you a record deal.
Yeah,
and I did.
There's a story in the book which I think is fascinating because you would never ever see this anymore, and it has to do with radio. And the Police are doing a show in upstate New York. There's 4 people in the audience, but the one guy that's in that audience happens to be in radio, and he winds up playing the song, and all of a sudden, like a cancer, it begins to spread all over the place. Now people are paying attention to the Police, and at that point, you can go to A&M Records and say, we really need to negotiate a deal here.
Well, no, that's not what happened, basically. I had already made the deal with A&M Records.
Right.
I made it in England. That single was recorded and released on A&M, and it didn't do anything in England. So I decided, well, I'm going to take them to America. And the record that got played in by the one DJ was the British release. It was that they had brought a bunch of copies with them to England. So the fact that it got attention on the radio meant that the American side of the label all of a sudden noticed that they had this act out of England that was on the radio in America. And that's when Jerry Moss calls me up and says, is that my act as well in America? And I said, yes, it is. And he, well, we better do something. I said, yeah, you better. And so he says, well, get the band back here. We're going to start working the album. And that's how it started. So the record was already on I had already made the deal with A&M Records. I'd given them the record for free because I couldn't get a deal any other way. If I'd asked for money, would have told me to leave the room,
It's interesting that that's the approach you took with A&M, to get IRS artists distributed, because I mean it's really almost a no risk proposition for an A&M.
Well, that's part of this. There are two lessons there. One is that because when I was writing this memoir, my first attempt at writing a book was more like a marketing book. Basically, it was going to be like, how do you market something, And one of the lessons was that you never know where that break is coming from. So never be too proud. When you walk out into an audience and there's only 4 people, you don't know who's in that audience. It might be somebody that can change your life. So never be too proud to think, well, there's only 4 people there, I'm not playing, because you never know. So it's always put your best foot forward because you never know where the break's coming from. That's one lesson, The other lesson was that if you make an answer, the answer to be yes, make it easy for the yes, you're going to likely get a yes. So when you walk into somebody and say, look, it's free. I don't need your money. I don't need anything. Just this is yours. You've got it. It's already done. All you got to do is release it. The A&R guy would be like, well, gee, there's no risk here, so how bad could it be? And so I got the deal.
You also signed REM, and I know this was not a band that you were particularly blown away by when you heard them or saw them, but I know your brother Ian was pretty big on them. What made them special in your eyes and in hindsight and managing their career?
Well, in the beginning, the fan was my brother Ian, and then there were several people in the company, one of which was Jay Boberg, who had seen the group and decided that they were the kind of thing we should have. I and the police, actually, when we put them on at Shea Stadium, I mean, they were kind of boring, really. They kind of stood there. They didn't bother to dress up. They didn't even want to highlight the fact that the REM stood for Rapid Eye Movement, So I still had people to this day saying, oh, you used to handle REM. Who are REM? Because they thought the name was REM, not REM, which stood for Rapid Eye Movement. But as time went on, the thing about the REM, which was so interesting, was that they basically never renegotiated. They never were trouble. They never were a problem. It's like they just built each time and just went out and played and played and played and built and built and built. And they eventually ended up, they were the only act on IRS Records that actually fulfilled their contract. I think we had signed them for 6 albums, and they actually delivered 6 albums, Every other group broke up, like the Go-Go's broke up after the 3rd album,
Right.
Fine Young Cannibals after the 2nd album. So every group would, they never made it to album 4 and 5 and 6. REM was the only one that actually got to the full length of the contract.
There's a great story that at the end of their contract, they got pursued by a number of different record companies, but wind up getting something from Warner Brothers, and then tell us about that.
Well, obviously we were dead keen on re-signing the act, and we had tried to renegotiate with them along the way, which is part of the story is that REM. I would say, look, let's increase the money we pay you per album, and let's give you a higher royalty in return for giving us a couple more albums on the deal, And they would go like, well, no, we're fine, we're happy, we've got enough money, and we don't need any more money, and so, no, we'll just stick with the contract, and, at the end, you can compete like everybody else does, if, and if your offer is the best, well, we'll go with you. We love IRS, So we got to the last album, and of course, everybody and their mother is after the group because now they've just had a platinum album, So I go to Jerry Moss and I say, look, I mean, I've offered as much money as I can offer. Would you help me? And he said, well, I can pay up to $3 million, And so I thought, we got up, I don't know, between $3 and $4 million that we could offer the group, Well, of course, we ended up, it became between Warner Brothers and IRS Records. And finally, the group went back to Warner Brothers and said, well, Miles has offered us, $4 million. And, he's offered us all these other things here, and and then Warner Brothers finally said, well, look, whatever Miles offers you, we'll double it. And they gave him a letter, and the group comes back into my office. Well, actually, the lawyer and the manager, were very honorable guys, and they said, well, we just got back from Warner Brothers, and they said, whatever you're offering, we're going to double it, and we're going to get all our rights back for all our albums after the term of the contract, and can you match that? And I actually said to the group, I said to the manager and to the lawyer, I said, look, here's my advice. Get the fuck out of my office, go straight to Warner Brothers, sign this deal before they change their mind, because it's the best deal I ever saw. And congratulations.
And they want to make it a lot more money than maybe anybody else.
Oh, they went there and they made a fantastic deal.
Wow.
And then when that deal was up, they made the biggest deal in the history of the music business. What they had done, they were free agents, and I hated to lose them, and I know a lot of people in the company were very upset that we lost REM. But I just could not compete with Warner Brothers. Even Jerry Moss was not prepared to compete. The reality is we had to say goodbye. And I'm very proud of them. The fact that they stuck to their guns and they went all the way through, and they've actually proved the point that I made in the book that if you stick to your guns and you're a total free agent and you're already hot, you can make a much better deal than if you keep renegotiating and just get a bit more money today. In other words, but of course there are a lot of bands that never made it to album 5 and 6.
Right.
So in the case of most bands, they should have renegotiated, like the Go-Go's did. The Go-Go's renegotiated after the first album. They never made it to the third album. I got two more records on the deal, but what good did that do me? Because they never got there.
Another aspect of this that is clearly in the book, and there are some bands that don't make the mistake of shooting themselves in the foot along the way. REM would be a perfectly good example of that. But there are more cases than not of bands that, for whatever reason, intentionally or unintentionally, kind of sabotage themselves as a result of either self-doubt or being maybe too aggressive, wanting to renegotiate a deal. And like you said, a lot of these bands never made a fourth and fifth album. The bands like Lords of the New Church or Wall of Voodoo or English Beat, and even like you said, the Go-Go's, who came out of the gate swinging. I mean, there had never been an all-girl group that had produced a -- 1 album before. That had never ever happened, and I don't believe it's really happened since that I can recall. But
no, it hasn't. Yeah.
What separates the bands that find success from the bands that don't find the longevity?
I have all sorts of different theories about it, but I think a lot of times, number one is when you go out and you're successful, everybody tells you you're great and you can do no wrong, and you start believing a lot of this stuff. After a while, you start believing some of this stuff that people are telling you, That's number one. Number two is that, let's face it, you got to be a little crazy to think I can walk on stage and make people want to listen to me, and I can play to thousands of people, and they're all going to go, wow, aren't you great? You got to be a little crazy to do that. And I've had artists come to me and they play me their music, and they totally believe that they're brilliant. And half of me says to myself, well, if they didn't believe that, they wouldn't be in my office. But the other side of it is they're actually crazy and they're talentless, but yet they're, so in a way, you've got to be kind of crazy to walk on stage. And that craziness can be a self-destruct. So in a way, it's a double-edged sword, But there are some of those people that really do accept who they are. And that was one of the stories about Bruce Springsteen. He had no sort of delusions of grandeur. I remember him saying, hey, basically we're just a bar band. We go out and we do a hell of a show, but we're just basically a bar band. And they didn't get he didn't become so enamored with Sting's musicians, who were really brilliant musicians. And he just went out there and he delivered. But he knew his audience. And the story I tell is when, we arrive in Costa Rica, and he's saying, as he's driving in and he's looking at the audience and he's saying, La Bamba. That's the song that's going to win these people over. And, of course, nobody in the entourage, Peter Gabriel and Sting and Bruce Springsteen himself and Tracy Chapman and all, the various other bands on the bill, None of them played La Bamba. So we're driving in, and he sort of throws this out to the group, almost like a challenge to say, well, you want to win these people over? Play La Bamba. Of course, Tracy Chapman doesn't do it, and Peter Gabriel doesn't do it, and Sting doesn't do it, and Springsteen doesn't do it until about three-quarters of the way through his set, or halfway through or whatever. And I remember standing on the side of the stage with Sting, and he kind of looked over at us as if to say, well, guys, I warned you. I told you. You could have done it. Watch this. And then he starts, la, 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 ba, ba. The place erupted, and he owned the show. And for that moment, I thought to myself, that is a real, honest, straightforward, no question about it, superstar who gets what his job is. Walk out there and deliver to the people what they want, and also deliver what you do as well. And he just did it, And I think he made fools out of all of us,
Although it's hard to imagine Peter Gabriel singing La Bamba. Maybe Sting, but Peter Gabriel, I just can't see it. I don't know.
No, I would have various ideas for Peter Gabriel. I remember him. I would sit on the plane, and because I loved Peter Gabriel. He was always very interesting, And I'd go in and say, "Well, Peter, what about doing this?" And he'd look at me like I had two heads, Sting would occasionally say, "Okay, yeah, I like that idea," and he would do it, And which was why I liked Sting, because I could always and the Police, I could throw ideas out, and they would not be just dismissed out of hand. The same with Jules Holland, Whereas some acts, you would throw out an idea, and they would just find every reason why it might not work before they would think about why it would work, Whereas the Police, Jules Holland, and the kind of up groups would say, well, yeah, why not? Let's try it, And I always found that more inspiring for me to keep coming up with crazy ideas,
The business of music has changed exponentially over the years. Between like a digital delivery system unlike you've ever seen before, a real lack of physical product to sell, and it seems like that the record companies either were caught way off guard or weren't thinking forward enough to be a part of that, and as a result, music seems to have changed.
Well, there's one fundamental thing which has always been there and still there and will always be there, and that is that if you don't know it exists, it doesn't exist. I don't care how good you are. I don't care how brilliant your song is. If the public doesn't know it exists, it might as well be shit. Okay?
Right.
So the job is always, how do I get to be known? How do I get people to know that I exist? How do I get people to be in a position that they could judge my music? And then they can decide whether they like the music or not. But if they can't ever judge it, they can't decide whether they like it or not. So the effort to promote something has always been the same. It's changed now. Okay, now you can do it through the internet, or you can do it through, various opportunities that exist today that did not exist when we first started. MTV came along and that offered new opportunities, and then, the new channels in England offered new opportunities, the internet and whatever, Spotify, whatever. But if it doesn't exist, so marketing has always been there. And, that has not changed. The delivery system has changed. And now it's possible for a guy sitting in his living room to create something and put it out, but the job is still the same. How do I get to be noticed? That's the name of the game. And whether it be Beats Antique, who was being promoted by belly dancers, or it was being promoted on the radio, it's all the same. It's get noticed.
But that's become harder for record companies to do, and maybe it's not maybe they don't see that their job that way. What's happened
to record companies is that they've started thinking, well, why do we want to send an A&R guy out to clubs to make a guess? So, now when you walk into a record company and to try to get a record deal, they say, well, okay, before you play me any music, where are you on social media? How many likes do you have? How many friends do you have? How many play? They look and see what the stats are. And if you don't register, they say, get the hell out of my office. Why do I want to listen to your music? So now the record companies you don't go to clubs anymore and see A&R guys hanging out looking to see if to discover a group. They'll discover it on the internet. Look at YouTube and see how many views you've got.
But even the internet and even the streaming services are like a swamp. If there's so much there's so much
There's always been so much there.
There's always been so much there, but it's like the delivery system, like in the case of Spotify, they decide what they think you will like based upon your habits.
What you like. In other words, they're studying what you like, and then they're giving you what they think you'll like. Well, advertising has always done that. If you look at a car commercial, hey, if you like this car, our car is better and cheaper.
Right.
A lot of products are sold based on another product. We're cheaper. We're 1% better. We're if you like so and so, you're really going to like this. A lot of advertising. So again, it always comes down to marketing. There's always been a selection there. How do I get noticed? Now it could be Lady Gaga wearing wild clothes. It could be Kiss painting their faces. It could be doing outrageous things that get you noticed. Is what the Sex Pistols were all about. I mean, so if you think back at Malcolm McLaren was a marketing genius. His job was but he stopped at the point of saying, well, okay, I've got attention now. What do I do with it? I think in the end he was selling himself, but he really wasn't selling the Sex Pistols. He got noticed. So that really is the name of the game. Right. So at the end of it, the advice to any musician is, look, the name of the game has always been the same. How do I get noticed? Do I do it through internet? Do I do it through Facebook? Do I do it through YouTube? Do I do it through... How do I get noticed? That's the name of the game. It's always been the name of the game. Radio may not play as big a role as it used to, or MTV, or any other way, but playing live is a way to get noticed, and the bands that go out and play live build their base up. I remember the Who saying to me, well, we built our whole thing in America by playing and playing and playing, which is really like a lot of what the Police did. We played every dive in America over and over again. The book, like I said, it's a great read. It goes by pretty quick. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Miles Copeland, it's a real pleasure to talk to you, and I really appreciate the time today. Thank you. Nice to talk to you, too. All right, Miles. Thank you very much. Again, the name of the book is 2 Steps Forward, 1 Step Back by Miles Copeland. It's scheduled to come out later next month. If you enjoyed the podcast, I'd love to hear about it. You can email me at bax@rock102.com. Thanks again for listening. We'll catch you next time on Baxy's Musical Podcast.